The dying church is good news. Dying with dignity is a contemporary concern in Australia, and many of us are glad that individuals are being given more control and more options facing the end of life. And behind that legislation is a long history of movement away from the death as a taboo subject, with a new emphasis on the dying experience ahead of death. Dying can be okay, especially for an aged person. And it can be made a positive experience, even for a younger person not wanting to die. But we all realize that isn't always easy and doesn't always happen. These are the ways I'm inviting us into a conversation about the dying church and how do these experiences relate. I've got some metaphors, pictures to share. Many of the congregation will already be familiar with the view that under Roman Emperor Constantine, the church made a fatal lurch from being a servanthood community to becoming an imperial power. And perhaps if the span of a human life is a metaphor for the life of 2,000 years of church, then the 4th century councils, out of which came the creeds, which are still the bottom line for all orthodoxy, perhaps these creeds represent the adolescent stage of human life, when a young adult asserts their independence, cuts free from family traditions, takes a different path, not always for the best. Now that metaphor breaks down a bit, but we'll come back to it. Then there's the metaphor of Genesis chapter 3. Which says nothing about the fall, although that's the word put on it. It's about eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in that story, the narrator tells us that Eve, and let's not put too much into this difference between the role of the woman and the man. The narrator tells us that Eve had 3 things in her mind as she looked at that fruit. It doesn't say it was an apple. The power, it looked attractive, and the power of our church looked attractive in this imperial age of Rome. The church fathers, and there were very few mothers, thought that churchly power was truly divine power. Oh my. Fantastic. Then, 2 old men who debated the finer points of Christian truth, the metaphysics that they were bound to by their Greek categories of thought. There's 4 sermons in that phrase. To these old men, definitive creedal statements seem nothing less than the knowledge. Taxi driver in London, the knowledge of good and evil. And that's what they thought they'd wrapped up in the 4th century. The knowledge. And that's what the woman saw, the knowledge of good and evil in this fruit. And then lastly, the taste. The temptation of power has a taste. To some of these leaders of the church and appealed to their hubris, who were mostly good and faithful Christian leaders. So the adolescence of the church, some kind of self-assertion, the feeling that I'm all powerful and nothing can happen to me, which is typical of young adults in some cases. The metaphor of Genesis 3, the temptations of the power the knowledge and the taste. The upshot of all of this, as I'm laying before us where we've come, is that the church is now overwhelmed by the knowledge of good and evil, its own experience of both, the knowledge in the Greek and the Hebrew language, a practical knowledge. And the church, which has so often fallen in ethical ways over the years, is now falling in numbers. For eating the fruit, the man and the woman are told that they will die sooner or later. And what strikes me is in the text, and the way I've heard this preached sometimes over the years, this is bad news, that we're going to die. But now we know that dying is going to come our way whether we're good or whether we're bad. So how can we interpret this story in the 20th century? 21st, all of which makes me think that the institutional, if no longer imperial church, is also destined to die just as we are, regardless of whether we're good church or bad church. Should we be worried? Should we work to prolong the life of the dying church at all costs? Because like a doctor, we can't deal with death. These are the questions I want us to ask, and I'm only beginning the conversation. But I am here to preach to you that the church dying is okay. And I want to tease this out a bit. The church dying is welcome. The church dying is a necessity in certain ways. And so thank God, however we may conceive of God, for the end of the adolescent experiment of the institutional church, the power church. Another metaphor, Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. That institutional church has always been bypass meadow, where Pilgrim goes off and sleeps and various things happen. The institutional church has always been a departure from the authentic way of Jesus, that progressing pilgrims, progressing pilgrims should take. And I'd like to invite you to stay with me thinking about how this happened. So the dying church is okay. And now I'd like us to think for a bit about how this happened. And I think maybe the fatal change for the serving church that became a ruling church was foreshadowed in the New Testament in several texts. And particularly the one where it says, the followers of Jesus were first called Christians at Antioch. There was a name change. And personally, I don't think this was for the good. And with the name change to Christianity came the crumbling edifice of Christology, a theological construct that has burdened the church all these years. But Jesus' followers already had a perfectly good name. People of the way. Thank you. Now, people of the way. Well, this is interesting. John's Gospel traces this name to Jesus himself, and I'm glad that it does. Because Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, according to John. And in that naming by John, there's a very existential kind of faith, a lived experience faith. It's not encumbered by atonement theology of blood sacrifice. It's not encumbered by any Christology of the divine man, come from God and going back to God. It is simply, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And going further, way, journey, uniting church, life, living, eating, being with our kids, and in between, truth. So this kind of truth must be a life type of truth, not a propositional truth, a lived experience truth, that Jesus' truth is his lived way of being. People of the way is also significant in the Pauline texts. We've got the Johannine, we've got the Pauline, because he said to those Roman rulers to which he made his testimony, I was a persecutor of the people of the way. And at another point he said, I also am a follower of the way. And those texts don't seem to mention Jesus directly, although that's definitely there. So there's a name change here, and I think this is really food for thought. Do you notice what happens with this name change? There's a shift. There's a shift away from the teaching, the way, the truth, the life teaching, onto the teacher, framed in theology under the heading, the person and work of Christ. There's a shift because people known by their dynamic way of living, and they shared things in a communistic way, people known by their dynamic way of life became identified with static words of belief in the creeds. People following Jesus' way of relinquishment, who had no resting place for his head, became people identified with castle churches, earthly property, fortresses of faith. And the message of salvation that Jesus repeatedly gave, that we have to lose in order to find, in fear and trembling, was replaced by a preaching of salvation. Come home to Mother Church, security. Here is the package deal for you, tied up with a bow, and you can buy into it. And if you say and believe the right things, you are saved. Religion in various forms replaced the lively spirituality of communities of faith. This is how I see what has happened over 2,000 years. And it's in that context that I can say to myself, the dying church is great. It will give us the chance, as the vision statement says, to get back to the hope of the gospel. So this is why I looked through the vision statement, the strategic review, and I'll come back to it again next week. And I've reflected already to you the issues that arise from it, the God talk, the vicarious theology of substitution, where we are only instruments and not agents, and how it comes to those magnificent words, we are to walk in the way. I don't know whether the writers of this vision statement consciously went through the thoughts we've just shared, the change from the way to Christianity, but praise God, it's there. And we're back in our church to asking how we can walk that way. Perhaps you will agree that some of the statements in the vision statement which say reconciliation, which say compassion, which say justice, which say creation, are the hallmarks of a living church. They are the hallmarks of St. Michael's. And these are great things to read in this statement offered us. Even though some of my colleagues in a progressive part of the church are very suspicious of things like strategic reviews, some very powerful things have come out of it. So, coming to St. Michael's now. Here's a congregation already confronted by the idea of new faith. And it probably doesn't seem too outrageous to you for the preacher to assert that the package deal of Christian orthodoxy, the creeds, Christology, atonement, spiritual laws, is in fact repugnant to the real way of Jesus. For all that, I'm not advocating a new faith. I'm reminding ourselves of the original way of faith that Jesus represented. And I certainly believe that we can all experience this in new ways. And as a person adopted himself into the uniting church, I welcome those parts of the basis of union which are so clear about the engagement with contemporary thought, scholarly interpretation, even though I'm quickly passing over some of the other parts of the basis. Next week, we might consider a little bit more what this way of faith in a living church will mean. If I was to sum it up now, and it gives us a chance to kind of pick up in more detail, the living church is going to be a very biblically based church. But you've got to cherry pick the Bible for meaning. You can quote me on that. We need to be biblical. We need to take the metaphors of the Bible and make them alive. We need to be progressive because, after all, the whole of Christian and Jewish revelation is about a progressive understanding. So the Bible is progressive. It's learning as it goes. And if we will articulate those stories that Jesus told, we will have a true orthodoxy, even though the creeds are still in the drawer. And we will also have an evangelical faith. Good news, something to say, not just opinions and different ideas, but something motivational and transformative. So, I wonder if you had a chance to read my misquote of the gospel in the order that you received, where I wrote, "They who will save their church will lose it, but they who will lose their church for my sake and the gospel of the way will save it." I believe this and similar texts preserve something very important in Christian understanding, and that is irony. The unpredictable, the counterintuitive, and that one of the most profound and life-giving things about Jesus' teaching, even through the filter of the Gospels and Paul, is the irony of God, or the irony of the holy. Things are not what they seem. The way things will turn out is not going to be what you expect. And to live with this irony is a powerful motivation for a kind of openness to God, to one another. So what could be the good news, the gospel of the dying church? Freedom from the pressure to believe arcane creeds written in a language and categories that make no sense. Freedom of belief. 2, release from the demands of an institutional church and its rosters. And where would we be without the rosters? We need the rosters. We want everyone on the rosters. But they remind us of the institutional church and of doing stuff and being responsible and sapping our energy. The dying church, if we could see the problem of it, is a huge amount of property is tied up in money. And can we be a dying church through which the resources, financial and capital, are released to employ people to meet needs? I think we're on that track. And then the opportunity when the church dies to build new communities in our neighbourhoods. I'm going to finish. It's a blessing to be a part, for me and you, of a great heritage like St. Michael's and the wider Uniting Church in Australia. It's a blessing. We cannot wind the clock back to the first century. We are not going to liquidate the resources that we have received as a trust from previous generations. But let us ponder how to do church in the way of dying, in the way of relinquishing, in the way of Buddha, in the way of risking, in the way of freedom and free thinking. If we can grasp the irony of being a dying church, a church that is counterintuitive to our natural way of thinking, then what Jesus brought to the world 2018 minus some years ago, what he brought, we will be able to make real to our community, our children, our grandchildren in the year 2018. To be continued.